Check, she would say, turning on the light. No explanations for 15 years. Last night I decided to pretend I was sleeping, and I watched her place a bucket of some black liquid next to my bed. Then she started whispering, "He's still here. Don't take him away." Living in our cramped two-bedroom apartment in Ohio, I thought this was just another one of my mom's weird habits. She had plenty of them. Keeping all the curtains drawn during the day, never letting me stay over at friends' houses, always checking the locks 3 times before bed. But the 3:17 wake-ups were the most consistent thing in my life, more reliable than sunrise or her morning coffee. I grew up thinking every kid went through this. When I was little, I'd stumble out of bed, half asleep, and she'd shine a small flashlight in my eyes, check my pulse, ask me to say my name and birth date. Then she'd nod, turn off the light, and I'd crawl back under my covers. It became so routine that my body started waking up naturally at 3:16, just waiting for her footsteps in the hallway. By middle school, I started questioning it more. My friends thought it was bizarre when I mentioned it, but Mom always had an explanation ready. Sleep disorder monitoring, she'd say, making sure I wasn't having night terrors. Checking for signs of sleepwalking. The answers changed, but her determination never wavered. High school made everything harder. I was exhausted constantly, falling asleep in classes, unable to focus during tests. My grades suffered, and teachers started calling home. Mom would apologize to them, promise to talk to doctors, but nothing ever changed. The 3:17 ritual continued like clockwork. When I turned 18 last year, I thought things might be different. I had plans to move out for college, maybe finally get a full night's sleep. But every time I brought up leaving, Mom would get this panicked look in her eyes. She'd start talking about how dangerous the world was, how I wasn't ready, how she needed to keep protecting me just a little longer. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago. I'd been accepted to a state school about 2 hours away, and orientation was approaching fast. Mom's behavior became more erratic. She started the 3:17 checks twice some nights, and I caught her standing in my doorway at random hours, just watching me sleep. The flashlight checks got longer, more intense, and she began muttering things under her breath that I couldn't quite make out. That's when I decided to fake sleeping and see what really happened during these middle-of-the-night visits. I'd practiced controlling my breathing, keeping my eyes closed even when bright light hit them, staying completely still no matter what. Last night, I finally went through with it. At 3:16, I heard her footsteps approaching. My door creaked open, and I could sense her standing there for what felt like forever. Usually, she'd wake me immediately, but this time she just stood and waited. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure she'd hear it, but I forced myself to keep breathing slowly and steadily. Then I heard something I'd never noticed before, the sound of liquid sloshing. She was carrying something heavy. Through barely opened eyelids, I watched her place a metal bucket next to my bed. The smell hit me immediately, something acrid and chemical, mixed with what seemed like burnt herbs. The liquid inside was completely black, thick like motor oil, but with an oily shimmer that reflected the hallway light. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about my life. Mom knelt beside the bucket and started whispering in a voice I'd never heard her use before. It was desperate, pleading, almost like she was negotiating with someone who wasn't there. Her words were mostly unclear, but I caught fragments. "Still here, don't take him, need more time, he's fighting it." She repeated these phrases over and over, sometimes in what sounded like a completely different language. After about 10 minutes of this bizarre ritual, she stood up, picked up the bucket, and started to leave. But then she stopped and turned back toward my bed. In the dim light, I could see her face, and the expression there was pure terror. She looked at me like I was something dangerous, something she was afraid of but couldn't abandon. She whispered one more thing before leaving. Day 5478. The imitation is getting stronger. I lay there for hours after she left, trying to process what I'd witnessed. The numbers kept spinning in my head. 5,478 days would be almost exactly 15 years. She'd been counting every single day since these wake-ups started. But counting toward what? The next morning, I waited until Mom left for work, then started searching through her room. I'd never been allowed in there unsupervised, and now I understood why. Hidden behind a loose floorboard under her bed, I found a journal bound in what looked like black leather. The cover was worn smooth from handling, and the pages inside were filled with her handwriting in different colored inks: black, red, sometimes what looked like brown. Reading that journal was like discovering I'd been living in a completely different reality than I thought. Update 1. The journal. The entry started when I was 3 years old, right after what Mom had always told me was a routine surgery to remove my appendix. But according to her detailed notes, it wasn't routine at all. I'd gone into cardiac arrest on the operating table and been clinically dead for 8 minutes and 43 seconds. The first entry was dated the day I came home from the hospital. Day 1. He came back wrong. During the flatline, something else came back with him. I can see it behind his eyes sometimes, watching me, learning. The doctors don't understand. They think I'm being paranoid, but mothers know. We always know. The entries continued chronologically, documenting every strange thing I'd apparently done as a young child that I had no memory of. Speaking in languages I'd never learned. Knowing things about dead relatives I'd never met. Predicting minor accidents before they happened. According to Mom's observations, these incidents happened most frequently right after I'd been sleeping deeply. Day 127. Caught him standing in the kitchen at 2 a.m., staring at the knives. When I asked what he was doing, he turned around with that blank expression and said he was studying the tools. His voice was different, older, colder. By morning, he had no memory of it. Day 203. Found drawings under his bed of people I've never seen before, but they're dressed in old-fashioned clothes. When I showed them to him, he started crying and said he didn't know why he drew them. The faces are too detailed for a 4-year-old. Day 456. The thing is getting bolder. Today he told me about my grandmother's death, details I never shared with him about how she looked in the hospital. He described the exact pattern of the wallpaper in her room, the smell of the flowers by her bedside. He's never been to that hospital. Page after page documented these incidents, along with Mom's growing desperation to find a solution. She'd consulted with people she called practitioners, individuals who understood what she believed had happened to me. They'd told her that when someone dies and comes back, sometimes they don't return alone. The barrier between worlds becomes thin, and things can slip through. The 317 wake-ups, according to these practitioners, were a containment ritual. The theory was that whatever had attached itself to me was strongest when I was in deep sleep, particularly during REM cycles. By interrupting my sleep at the same time every night, Mom was preventing it from gaining full control. The specific time wasn't arbitrary. 3:17 a.m. was apparently when the veil between worlds was thinnest, making it the most dangerous time for possession. But the most disturbing entries came from recent months. Day 5461. The interruptions aren't working as well anymore. He's learning to hide the signs better. Yesterday, I found him in the basement, and he claimed he was looking for Christmas decorations in July. But we don't have a basement. We live in a second-floor apartment. When I pointed this out, he looked confused, like he was waking up from a dream. Day 5472. Caught him talking to himself in the mirror, but his lips weren't moving in sync with the reflection. When I confronted him about it, he seemed genuinely confused. The thing is learning to mimic him perfectly. Day 5478. His pupils stay dilated longer after each wake-up. It's learning to imitate him better, but small details give it away. This morning he put salt in his coffee instead of sugar and didn't notice until I pointed it out. He never makes mistakes like that. The final entry was from yesterday. Day 5479. I don't think the ritual is containing it anymore. It's getting stronger, smarter. Soon I won't be able to tell the difference. I need to find another solution before it takes him completely. The practitioners warned me this day would come. They said I'd have to make a choice. Lose my son to save him, or lose myself trying to keep him. I sat on Mom's bedroom floor, holding this journal, trying to reconcile everything I'd just read with my memories of growing up. The incidents she described, I had no recollection of any of them. But as I thought harder, I started remembering gaps. Mornings when I'd wake up exhausted even though I'd gone to bed early. Finding mud on my shoes when I hadn't been outside. Discovering drawings or writing in my room that I didn't remember creating. And then there were the dreams, or what I'd always assumed were dreams. Vivid experiences of being in places I'd never visited, talking to people I'd never met, living entire days that felt completely real until I woke up. I'd always dismissed them as having an overactive imagination, but now I wondered if they were something else entirely. The worst part was that reading Mom's journal triggered a strange sense of recognition. Not of the specific incidents she described, but of the feeling she was trying to capture. The sense that sometimes I wasn't entirely myself, that there were moments when I felt like a passenger in my own body. I spent the rest of the day in a state of shock, trying to decide what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to confront Mom immediately, demand explanations, maybe even call her crazy and storm out. But another part of me, a part that felt disturbingly unfamiliar, was curious about what would happen if I just let things continue. That night, I went to bed early and waited for 3:17. When Mom came in with her flashlight, I submitted to the usual routine: pulse check, eye examination, basic questions. But this time, I was studying her face as much as she was studying mine. The fear there was real and deep, but so was the love. Whatever she believed was happening to me, her terror was genuine. After she left, I couldn't fall back asleep. I kept thinking about her journal entry describing how my pupils stayed dilated longer after each wake-up. So I got up and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, trying to see what she was seeing. That's when I noticed it for the first time, a tiny delay between when I decided to blink and when my eyelids actually moved. It was barely perceptible, maybe half a second, but it was definitely there. Like there was some kind of lag between my thoughts and my actions. I stood there for 20 minutes, testing different movements, and the delay was consistent. When I decided to raise my hand, there was a pause before it moved. When I wanted to turn my head, it took a moment longer than it should have. It was as if something else had to approve each action before my body would respond. The strangest part was that this delay felt normal to me. I couldn't remember a time when my movements felt more immediate than this, which made me wonder, how long had this been happening? And if I couldn't remember it being different, what did that say about my memories in general? Update 2, the test. I decided to conduct my own investigation. If Mom was right about something else sharing my body, I needed to understand what that meant and what I could do about it. I started keeping my own journal, documenting every strange thought, unusual dream, or moment when I felt disconnected from my actions. The results were more disturbing than I'd expected. Over the course of a week, I documented dozens of small incidents that I'd previously dismissed as normal absent-mindedness. Making breakfast and finding I prepared food I didn't like. Starting to walk towards school and ending up several blocks in the wrong direction. Sitting down to do homework and discovering I'd written notes in handwriting that looked almost like mine, but slightly different. The letters more angular, the spacing tighter. But the real breakthrough came when I decided to test Mom's theory about the 3:17 wake-ups. If something was indeed trying to take control while I slept, what would happen if I prevented the interruption? I waited until Mom went out of town for a weekend to visit her sister, the first time she'd left me alone overnight in years. She'd been reluctant to go, calling multiple times to confirm I'd be okay, making me promise to check in every few hours. Now I understood her anxiety wasn't about typical parental worry. That first night without the 3:17 wake-up, I slept deeper than I had in years. But I also had the most vivid and disturbing dreams of my life. I dreamed I was living in a house I'd never seen before, surrounded by people who treated me like family but whom I didn't recognize. The strange part was how natural it all felt, like I was remembering rather than dreaming. In the dream, I had detailed knowledge about these people's lives, their relationships, their secrets. I knew that the older woman had lost a child in a fire decades earlier. I knew the middle-aged man was hiding gambling debts from his wife. I knew the teenage girl was planning to run away from home. But I also knew things I shouldn't have been able to know, like where they kept their spare keys, what medications they took, which windows in their house didn't lock properly. When I woke up the next morning, I felt different. More alert in some ways, but also more detached. It was like I was viewing my own life from a slight distance, observing rather than fully experiencing. And I had an overwhelming urge to go places I'd never been before, to find people I'd never met but felt like I knew intimately. Instead of fighting these urges, I decided to follow them and see where they led. The first address that came to mind was across town in a neighborhood I'd never visited. I took 2 buses to get there, somehow knowing exactly which stops to take even though I'd never made this trip before. When I arrived at the house, it was exactly as I'd seen it in my dream. A small blue cottage with a white picket fence and a garden full of roses. I stood across the street for an hour, watching. An elderly woman came out to water her plants, and I knew with absolute certainty that her name was Dorothy, that she'd lived in this house for 43 years, and that she'd recently started leaving her back door unlocked because she was becoming forgetful about her keys. The knowledge was so specific and confident that it scared me. I'd never seen this woman before in my life, never been to this neighborhood, never had any reason to know anything about her routine. But the information felt as real and reliable as knowing my own name. I went home and spent the evening researching everything I could about the address online. Public records confirmed that a Dorothy Morrison had indeed owned that house for over 4 decades. Her husband had died 3 years earlier. She had no children but was active in her church community. Everything I'd somehow known about her checked out. That night, I had another dream about a different family in a different house. Again, the knowledge was incredibly detailed and specific. Again, when I researched the location the next day, everything I'd dreamed matched reality. By the 3rd night, I was starting to understand what Mom had been so afraid of. Whatever was sharing space in my head had access to information I shouldn't possess. It knew about people I'd never met, places I'd never been, events I'd never witnessed. And each night, without the 317 interruption, its knowledge seemed to become more accessible to my conscious mind. But the most disturbing realization came when I found myself standing outside Dorothy's house again, this time at night. I had no memory of deciding to go there or of making the trip across town. One moment I was at home doing homework, and the next I was standing in her backyard, knowing exactly how to avoid the motion sensor lights and which path through her garden would be quietest. I stood there for several minutes, understanding that I was exactly where the other presence wanted me to be, but having no idea what it intended to do next. Dorothy's house was dark except for a single light in what I somehow knew was her bedroom. The back door was unlocked, just as I'd known it would be. Instead of going inside, I forced myself to leave. The walk home felt like fighting against a strong current. Every step away from that house required conscious effort and determination. By the time I reached my own apartment, I was exhausted and shaking. When Mom returned the next day, she took one look at me and knew something had changed. Without saying a word, she pulled out her journal and started writing. That night, she resumed the 317 wake-ups, but they were different now. More intense, longer, with additional tests I'd never experienced before. She made me recite my full name, address, and birth date multiple times. She asked me to describe my earliest memory, my favorite food, my biggest fear. She shined the flashlight directly into my eyes for extended periods, studying my reactions. And at the end of each session, she'd make me look at myself in a hand mirror while she watched my reflection. It was during one of these mirror tests that we both saw it at the same time. For just a moment, maybe 2 or 3 seconds, my reflection moved independently. While I was looking straight ahead, my reflection turned slightly to the side, as if it was trying to see something beyond the edge of the mirror. When I shifted my gaze to follow the reflection's movement, it snapped back to matching my position perfectly. Mom's face went completely white. She set down the mirror with trembling hands and left my room without saying anything. But I heard her on the phone for hours afterward, speaking in hushed, urgent tones to people she'd never let me meet. The next morning, she told me we were going on a trip. Update 3, the choice. The trip turned out to be a 6-hour drive to a remote cabin in the mountains of West Virginia. Mom had borrowed a car from a friend and packed bags for both of us, but she wouldn't explain where we were going or why. She just kept saying that she'd found people who could help us, that she should have done this years ago, that she was sorry for waiting so long. The cabin belonged to a group Mom called the Practitioners, the same people she'd consulted with when I was young. There were 5 of them, ranging in age from about 30 to 70, and they all had the same intense, knowing look in their eyes. They weren't what I'd expected, no crystals or candles or mystical robes. They dressed like ordinary people and lived in what appeared to be an ordinary cabin, but there was something about their presence that made the air feel thick and charged. The oldest member of the group, a woman with silver hair and sharp blue eyes, examined me the same way Mom had been doing for years, checking my pulse, looking into my eyes, asking me personal questions. But her examination was more thorough and somehow more invasive. She had me perform physical coordination tests, memory exercises, and psychological evaluations that lasted for hours. The other practitioners took detailed notes throughout the process, occasionally conferring with each other in voices too low for me to hear. By the end of the first day, they'd reached some kind of conclusion. What they told me changed my understanding of everything that had happened since I was 3 years old. According to their explanation, when someone dies and is brought back to life, their soul sometimes doesn't return alone. The boundary between life and death becomes permeable, and entities from the other side can slip through and attach themselves to the returning consciousness. These entities aren't necessarily evil, but they don't belong in the world of the living, and their presence creates an unstable situation for everyone involved. In my case, the entity that had attached itself to me was particularly old and powerful. It had been waiting on the other side for decades, looking for an opportunity to return to physical existence. When I died on that operating table, it saw its chance and followed me back. For 15 years, the 317 wake-ups had been preventing this entity from gaining full control of my body. But as I'd grown older and stronger, so had it. The practitioners explained that the entity had been learning to mimic me more effectively, gradually taking over more of my memories, personality, and physical responses. Eventually, there would be nothing left of the original me, just the entity wearing my face and living my life. But here's where the story took a turn I never saw coming. The silver-haired woman looked me directly in the eyes and said that based on their examination, the process was already much further along than anyone had realized. The consciousness I thought of as me was actually a hybrid, part original soul, part entity. I'd been sharing headspace for so long that the two had begun to merge into something new. This meant that the traditional solution, banishing the entity back to the other side, would likely destroy what remained of my original consciousness as well. 15 years of coexistence had made us too intertwined to separate cleanly. They presented me with 3 options, none of them particularly appealing. Option 1 was to attempt the banishment ritual anyway, knowing that it would probably result in my death. The entity would be gone, but so would I. Mom would lose her son either way, but at least she'd know that whatever was left behind wasn't wearing my face. Option 2 was to do nothing and let the entity complete its takeover. Within a few months, maybe weeks, there would be nothing left of my original consciousness. The thing that looked like me would have all my memories and could probably fool most people, but it wouldn't actually be me. Mom would keep her son in physical form, but not in any meaningful way. Option 3 was the most complex and dangerous. They could perform a different kind of ritual, not to banish the entity, but to stabilize the hybrid consciousness we'd become. It would mean accepting that I was no longer entirely human, but it would allow both aspects of my consciousness to coexist without one destroying the other. The catch was that this third option came with permanent consequences. I'd always be partially connected to the other side, always aware of things most people couldn't perceive. I'd have access to knowledge and abilities that weren't entirely natural, but I'd also be vulnerable to influences from the spirit world. And there was no guarantee the stabilization would work. It might just delay the inevitable takeover while making it more painful for everyone involved. Mom wanted me to choose option 1. She'd rather lose me completely than watch the entity wear my face for the rest of what would have been my life. But she also made it clear that whatever I decided, she'd support it. She'd spent 15 years fighting to save me, and she wasn't going to give up now by making the choice for me. I asked for time to think about it, and the practitioners gave me 3 days to decide. During that time, I experienced the most intense internal conflict I'd ever faced. The entity, or the part of me that was the entity, had its own perspective on the situation. It didn't want to die any more than I did, and it argued that we'd been coexisting successfully for years. Why change something that was working? But I also became more aware of how much the entity's presence had shaped my entire life. The social isolation, the constant exhaustion, the feeling of never quite fitting in anywhere, all of it could be traced back to this internal division. I'd never had a chance to find out who I really was or what I wanted from life because I'd always been sharing space with something else. On the final night before I had to make my decision, I had the most vivid dream yet. But this time, I was lucid enough to realize it wasn't entirely a dream. I was communicating directly with the entity, seeing its memories and understanding its perspective. It showed me what it had been like before attaching to me, existing in a gray, timeless space between worlds, watching the living but unable to participate in life. It had been waiting for over 60 years for a chance to return, growing more desperate and lonely with each passing decade. When my soul had briefly left my body during the surgery, the entity hadn't maliciously invaded. It had desperately grasped onto the only opportunity it had seen in decades to escape its prison. Over the years, it had grown genuinely attached to me and to Mom. It didn't want to hurt us or take over my life. It just wanted to exist, to experience physical sensation and human connection. In its own way, it loved me and was terrified of being banished back to the emptiness it had come from. This conversation changed everything about how I viewed the situation. I realized that the entity wasn't a parasite or invader. It was more like an accidental roommate who'd been trying to find a way to coexist peacefully. The knowledge it had about other people and places came from its decades of watching the living world from the other side. The physical coordination issues and memory gaps happened when we were fighting for control instead of working together. When I woke up from this dream conversation, I knew what my decision would be. Final update: the integration. I chose option 3, the stabilization ritual. Mom cried when I told her, but she also seemed relieved that I wasn't choosing certain death. The practitioners spent 2 days preparing for the ritual, gathering materials, and setting up protective barriers around the cabin. They explained that the process would be dangerous for everyone involved, not just me, and that there was about a 60% chance of success based on their previous experience with similar cases. The ritual itself was unlike anything I could have imagined. It lasted from sunset to sunrise and involved techniques that seemed to blur the line between psychology, medicine, and something that could only be described as magic. Without going into details that might sound unbelievable, I can say that it was the most intense physical and emotional experience of my life. But it worked. When I woke up the morning after the ritual, I felt different in ways that are hard to describe. The constant sense of internal conflict was gone, replaced by something that felt more like cooperation. I still had access to the entity's knowledge and memories, but now it felt like information I could choose to access rather than random intrusions into my consciousness. The practitioners explained that the stabilization had created what they called an integrated consciousness, still me, but expanded beyond what I'd been before. The entity was no longer a separate presence sharing my headspace. It had become a part of my overall identity, like a new organ or sense that I'd have to learn to use properly. The most immediate change was that I no longer needed the 317 wake-ups. The integration had eliminated the risk of the entity taking over while I slept, because there was no longer a separate entity to take over. Mom was skeptical at first, but after a week of letting me sleep through the night with no ill effects, she began to accept that something fundamental had changed. Other changes took longer to adjust to. I found I could sense things about people that I shouldn't have been able to know, their emotional states, sometimes fragments of their personal histories, occasionally even their thoughts if they were particularly strong or emotional. It wasn't telepathy exactly, but it was definitely more than normal human intuition. I also discovered I could perceive spirits and other entities that most people couldn't see. The world was full of presences that existed just slightly outside normal reality, not necessarily dangerous, but definitely there. Learning to filter out this extrasensory input took months of practice. But perhaps the most significant change was in my relationship with Mom. For the first time in 15 years, she could look at me without fear. The ritual had resolved her uncertainty about whether I was still her son. I was just expanded beyond what either of us had expected. We moved back home after spending 2 weeks at the cabin, and I started my senior year of high school with a completely new perspective on life. My grades improved dramatically because I was no longer constantly exhausted. I made friends more easily because I was no longer fighting internal battles during every social interaction. For the first time, I felt like I was living my own life instead of just surviving it. College was a revelation. Away from home and the constant reminders of my unusual childhood, I was able to explore who I was as an integrated consciousness. I studied psychology and anthropology, drawn to understanding human consciousness and the different ways cultures interpret experiences like mine. My professors found my insights unusually mature and perceptive, though they attributed it to being a thoughtful student rather than having literal decades of extra perspective. The entity's knowledge proved useful in unexpected ways. I could sense when professors were having bad days and adjust my approach accordingly. I could tell when classmates were struggling with personal problems and offer support at exactly the right moments. I seemed to have an intuitive understanding of people that made me a natural counselor and mediator. But I also had to learn to live with the knowledge that I wasn't entirely human anymore. Relationships were complicated because I could sense more about people than they realized, and intimacy required learning to respect boundaries even when I could perceive beyond them. I had to be careful not to let slip information I shouldn't have known, or to react to thoughts and feelings that others hadn't expressed verbally. After graduating college, I found work helping other people who'd had unusual spiritual experiences. The practitioners had introduced me to a network of individuals who specialized in what they called consciousness anomalies, people who'd had near-death experiences, unexplained psychic abilities, or encounters with entities like mine. My integrated perspective made me uniquely qualified to help others navigate similar situations. Mom and I maintained a close relationship, though it took years for her to fully trust that the integration was stable. She kept a modified version of her observation journal for several more years, noting changes in my behavior and abilities as I learned to manage my expanded consciousness. Eventually, she stopped needing to document everything and simply enjoyed having her son back, different than before, but definitively present and whole. The practitioners became something like extended family, people I could talk to about aspects of my experience that others wouldn't understand. They taught me meditation techniques for managing my expanded perceptions, ways to shield myself from unwanted spiritual influences, and methods for helping others who found themselves in similar situations. Looking back now, 15 years after the integration, I can honestly say that choosing option 3 was the right decision. I lost the possibility of being normal in the conventional sense, but I gained something much more valuable, the chance to be authentically myself, even if that self was more complex than most people's. The entity that attached to me all those years ago wasn't a monster or invader. It was a lost soul looking for connection and belonging. By accepting it as part of myself rather than fighting it or trying to banish it, I found a way for both of us to exist fully and peacefully. The knowledge and perspectives it brought enriched my life in ways I'm still discovering. Mom passed away 3 years ago, finally at peace knowing that her son had survived and thrived despite the unusual circumstances of his childhood. She'd spent 28 years protecting me from something she saw as a threat, only to discover that it could become an ally instead. Her dedication and love made it possible for me to survive long enough to find that solution. Today, I work with people who've had experiences similar to mine, helping them understand that consciousness is more flexible and resilient than most people realize. Not everyone who dies and comes back brings something with them, but for those who do, integration is often a better solution than banishment or denial. The 317 wake-ups stopped 15 years ago, but I still wake up naturally around that time most nights. Not because I have to, but because it's become a moment of gratitude for Mom's protection during those difficult years, for the entity that became part of me, and for the integrated consciousness that allows me to help others facing similar challenges. I never did figure out exactly why my reflection moved independently in that mirror all those years ago. But these days, when I look at myself, what I see looking back is definitely, completely, and authentically me, just more than I used to be.